In the drought-stricken valley of Cedar Falls, a woman stepped off the dusty stagecoach carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and secrets that could either save a dying town or destroy the fragile peace she'd spent years building. Clara Bennett had traveled halfway across the country to marry a man she'd never met. But what Thomas Mitchell didn't know was that his mail-order bride possessed a gift so extraordinary that desperate souls had once called her a saint, while others branded her a witch. The townspeople of Cedar Falls were about to discover that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, and that healing hands can mend more than just broken bones. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Cedar Falls, turning the main street into a ribbon of dust and desperation. Clara Bennett smoothed her travel-worn skirts and adjusted the simple blue bonnet that had protected her fair complexion during the 3-day journey from Denver. The stagecoach driver handed down her single piece of luggage, a battered leather case that contained everything she owned in the world, along with the carefully wrapped herbs and remedies she'd collected over the years. "You sure this is where you want to be dropped off, miss?" the driver asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ain't much here worth staying for, from what I can see." Clara surveyed the town before her with eyes the color of morning mist. Cedar Falls had clearly seen better days. Many of the storefronts stood empty, their windows dark and dusty. The few people visible on the street moved with the slow, defeated gait of those who had watched their dreams crumble with each passing season. Paint peeled from building facades like old skin, and the wooden sidewalks sagged under the weight of neglect. "This is exactly where I need to be," she replied softly, pressing a coin into the driver's palm. Her voice carried the faintest trace of an accent that spoke of Eastern refinement, though her calloused hands told a different story entirely. As the stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, Clara found herself truly alone for the first time in months. The silence of Cedar Falls pressed around her like a physical presence, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of a loose board somewhere down the street. She had expected Thomas Mitchell to meet her at the depot, but the platform stood empty save for a mangy dog that watched her with intelligent brown eyes. Margaret O'Connor emerged from the Copper Kettle Saloon, wiping her hands on a faded apron. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with auburn hair streaked with premature silver and the kind of shrewd gaze that came from running a business in a man's world. "You must be Clara Bennett," she said, extending a work-roughened hand. "Tom Mitchell asked me to keep an eye out for you. He got held up at the ranch, some trouble with sick cattle." Clara accepted the handshake, noting the genuine warmth in the other woman's grip, despite the cautious reserve in her manner. "Mrs. O'Connor, I presume? Mr. Mitchell mentioned you in his letters. Just Maggie, please. And welcome to what's left of Cedar Falls." She gestured toward the empty storefronts with a wry smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hope you're not expecting much in the way of excitement. Most folks around here are more concerned with making it through another day than celebrating new arrivals." As they walked toward the saloon, Clara's trained eye took in details that others might have missed. The way old Henry Peterson favored his left leg suggested an injury that hadn't healed properly. The persistent cough echoing from the direction of the general store spoke of lung troubles that went beyond a simple cold. Even Maggie herself moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain, though she clearly worked hard to hide it. "How long has the town been struggling?" Clara asked, genuinely curious rather than making conversation. Maggie paused at the saloon doors, considering her words carefully. "Started about 3 years back when the silver mine played out. Then we had 2 bad harvests in a row, and the fever took a lot of good people last winter. Doc Hayes does his best, but he's getting on in years, and his hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Some say Cedar Falls is cursed, but I reckon we're just having a run of bad luck." Inside the copper kettle, Clara was struck by how clean and well-maintained everything appeared, despite the town's obvious struggles. The wooden floors gleamed with fresh wax, the glasses behind the bar sparkled, and the air smelled of lemon. Oil and fresh bread rather than stale beer and tobacco. A handful of patrons sat at scattered tables, their conversations muted and their faces drawn with worry. "You've built something special here," Clara observed, running her fingers along the polished surface of a nearby table. "This kind of care doesn't happen by accident." For the first time since her arrival, Maggie's smile reached her eyes. "My Patrick always said a place is only as good as the love you put into it. He's been gone 5 years now, but I still hear his voice every time I polish these tables or sweep these floors." Dr. Samuel Hayes entered through the back door, his medical bag in one hand and exhaustion written across his lined face. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair that spoke of wisdom earned through decades of tending to the sick and injured. His clothes were clean but worn, and his hands bore the permanent stains of a physician's trade. "Another difficult case?" Maggie asked, already moving to pour him coffee without being asked. "Mrs. Patterson's youngest is running a fever that won't break," he replied, settling heavily into his usual chair. "I've tried everything I know, but I'm afraid my remedies aren't having much effect. Sometimes I wonder if this old doctor has forgotten more than he remembers." Clara felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the sensation she'd learned to recognize over the years whenever she encountered suffering that called to the deepest part of her nature. She'd trained herself to suppress these impulses, knowing too well the consequences of revealing her unusual abilities. But something about Dr. Hayes's gentle despair and the genuine care in his voice made her defenses waver. "Perhaps a fresh perspective might help," she suggested carefully. "I've had some experience with childhood fevers during my travels. Sometimes the simplest remedies are the most effective." Dr. Hayes looked up with new interest, his tired eyes sharpening as he studied her face. "Are you trained in medicine, Miss Bennett? There's something about your manner that suggests more than casual knowledge." Before Clara could formulate a safe response, the saloon doors burst open and Thomas Mitchell strode in, his boots leaving muddy tracks on Maggie's carefully cleaned floors. He was a man of perhaps 35 years, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that showed threads of premature gray and eyes the color of storm clouds. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, while another disappeared beneath his collar, speaking of some terrible encounter that had left more than physical marks. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been relief, "I'm sorry I wasn't there to meet you. We lost 3 head of cattle overnight, and I couldn't leave until we figured out what killed them." She rose to greet him, taking note of how his right hand trembled almost imperceptibly and the careful way he moved his left shoulder. Whatever had scarred his face had taken a toll on his entire body, though his pride clearly wouldn't allow him to acknowledge any weakness. "Mr. Mitchell," she replied, offering her hand in greeting. "I understand completely. Maggie has been very kind in making me feel welcome." When their hands touched, Clara felt the familiar tingling sensation that always preceded her awareness of another's condition. Through that brief contact, she sensed the complex web of his injuries, old fractures that hadn't set properly, muscle damage that caused constant low-level pain, and beneath it all, a deeper hurt that had nothing to do with physical trauma. Tom's eyes widened slightly at her touch, as if he'd felt something unusual as well, but he quickly masked his reaction. "I hope you're prepared for a simpler life than what you might be used to," he said, withdrawing his hand perhaps a moment sooner than politeness required. "Cedar Falls isn't much to look at these days." "I'm not here for the scenery," Clara replied gently. "I'm here because I believe everyone deserves a chance at happiness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Regardless of what the past has brought. Them. The words seemed to strike something deep within Tom's guarded expression, though he quickly looked away toward Dr. Hayes. "Doc, did you get a chance to look at those cattle? I've never seen anything like what killed them. No wounds, no signs of struggle, but they were healthy yesterday morning." Dr. Hayes shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid veterinary medicine was never my strongest area, Tom. Without being able to examine them myself, I can only guess at the cause. Could be poisonous plants, bad water, or even some kind of disease we haven't encountered before." Clara listened carefully to the discussion, her mind already cataloging possibilities based on the symptoms described. Years of studying both human and animal ailments had taught her to recognize patterns that others might miss. The sudden death of healthy animals with no external signs of trauma suggested several potential causes, most of them treatable if caught early enough. What did the animal's eyes look like? She asked quietly, and were there any unusual odors? Tom turned to her with surprise. Their eyes were clouded, almost milky, and there was a sweet smell like overripe fruit. "How did you know to ask about that?" "I grew up on a farm back east," Clara replied carefully, which was true enough even if it wasn't the complete truth. "We encountered similar problems occasionally. It sounds like they might have gotten into wild cherry leaves, or perhaps elderberry. Bark. Both can be fatal to cattle if consumed in large quantities, especially when the plants are wilting." Dr. Hayes leaned forward with renewed interest. "I've heard of such cases but never encountered them personally. Do you know if there's any treatment for the remaining animals?" "If caught early enough, yes. Activated charcoal can help absorb the toxins, and there are certain herbal remedies that support the liver's natural detoxification processes. But prevention is more important, finding and removing the source before more animals are affected." The room had fallen quiet as Clara spoke, and she became aware that everyone was looking at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to something approaching awe. She realized she'd revealed more knowledge than would be expected from a simple mail-order bride, but the desire to help had overcome her usual caution. Tom's scarred face showed a mixture of hope and suspicion. "You seem to know quite a lot about medicine for someone who grew up on a farm." "My grandmother was what some people might call a folk healer," Clara replied, choosing her words carefully. "She taught me about plants and their properties. It's knowledge that's been passed down through generations of women in my family." The explanation seemed to satisfy most of those present, though Dr. Hayes continued to study her with the keen attention of a professional recognizing expertise in an unexpected source. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows through the saloon windows. "I should get you settled at the ranch," Tom said finally. "We can discuss wedding arrangements once you've had a chance to rest and get your bearings." As they prepared to leave, Maggie caught Clara's arm gently. "That was well done," she murmured quietly. "Tom's been blaming himself for those cattle deaths. He couldn't afford to lose them, not with things as tight as they are." Clara nodded, understanding more than Maggie probably realized. In her experience, guilt and self-blame were often more destructive than any physical ailment, eating away at a person's spirit until healing became almost impossible. She had a feeling that Tom Mitchell's scars ran much deeper than the ones visible on his face. The ride to the Mitchell ranch passed mostly in silence, with Clara studying the landscape while Tom focused on the dusty road ahead. The valley stretched before them like a canvas painted in shades of brown and gold, with the promise of water marked by the dark line of cottonwoods that followed the creek bed. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing in fenced pastures, looking healthy enough despite their recent losses. "It's beautiful country," she said finally, meaning it despite the obvious signs of drought and hardship. "It was once," Tom replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Before the troubles started." My wife used to say that this valley could support a dozen families if we worked together and treated the land right. His hands tightened on the reins. She had a way of seeing the best in everything. Clara sensed the pain behind his words, the careful way he spoke of his deceased wife, as if her memory was both precious and unbearable. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. He was quiet for a long moment. I should probably explain why I sent for a mail-order bride. Most folks think it's strange, a man marrying someone he's never met. Everyone has their reasons for the choices they make, Clara replied gently. I'm not here to judge you, Thomas. I'm here because I believe we might be able to help each other find some peace. Something in her tone seemed to reach him, and he glanced at her with an expression that held surprise along with the ever-present wariness. You're not what I expected, he admitted. What did you expect? He considered the question seriously. Someone more practical, I suppose. Someone looking for security and willing to accept whatever came with it. But you speak like an educated woman, and the way you handled that situation with the cattle. He trailed off, shaking his head. I guess I'm wondering why someone like you would answer an advertisement from a man like me. Clara studied his profile, noting the careful way he held himself and the unconscious habit he had of touching the scar on his face when he was thinking. Perhaps, she said softly, we both have reasons for starting over in a place where the past doesn't define us. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill, and Clara felt her breath catch at the sight. It was a solid structure, built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that faced the mountains and windows positioned to catch the morning light. Someone had planted roses along the front of the house, though they showed signs of neglect in the current drought. Your wife had good taste, Clara observed, noting the thoughtful details that spoke of a woman's touch in the home's design. She drew up the plans herself, Tom replied, his voice softer now. Said a house should be more than just shelter, that it should be a place where souls could rest. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the front steps. I haven't been much good at maintaining her vision since she's been gone. As Clara climbed down from the wagon, she felt the same stirring sensation she'd experienced in town, but stronger now and more complex. This land held echoes of both joy and sorrow, love and loss, hope and despair. The very ground seemed to pulse with the accumulated emotions of those who had lived and died here. It's not the land that needs healing, she said quietly, almost to herself. Tom paused in lifting her trunk from the wagon bed. What did you say? Clara realized she'd spoken aloud and felt heat rise in her cheeks. I was just thinking that sometimes places hold memories, and those memories can either nurture growth or hold it back. He stared at her for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable in the fading light. You have an unusual way of looking at things, Clara Bennett. Is that a problem? I don't know yet, he replied honestly. But I have a feeling life around here is about to become a lot more interesting. As they approached the house, Clara noticed movement at one of the windows, a curtain falling quickly back into place as if someone had been watching their arrival. The sensation of being observed prickled along her spine, though she couldn't tell if the feeling came from human eyes or something less tangible. Tom must have noticed her slight hesitation. Is everything all right? Just getting my bearings, she replied, though her hand unconsciously moved to the small leather pouch she wore beneath her dress, where she kept her most precious herbs, and the few remaining mementos of the life she'd left behind. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a Native American woman of perhaps 50 years with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair, braided with small silver ornaments. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, but there was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of someone accustomed to respect. This is Running Bear, Tom explained. She's been helping me keep the house since. He didn't finish the sentence. Running Bear, this is Clara Bennett, my intended bride. The older woman studied Clara with an intensity that seemed to see far more than surface appearances. When she spoke, Her voice carried the cadence of someone for whom English was a carefully learned second language. "You carry the scent of healing plants," she observed without preamble. "Sage, willow bark, and something else. Something rare." Clara felt her pulse quicken. Running Bear's acute senses presented both an opportunity and a potential danger. "I enjoy learning about the properties of different plants," she replied carefully. "Learning is good," Running Bear nodded approvingly. "But knowing when to use knowledge is wisdom. Some gifts are meant to be shared. Others must be guarded carefully." The words seemed to carry layers of meaning that went far beyond casual conversation, and Clara found herself wondering exactly how much this perceptive woman had already guessed about her true nature. Tom looked between the two women with the expression of a man trying to follow a conversation conducted in a foreign language. "Well," he said finally, "I'll leave you two to get acquainted while I tend to the horses. Running Bear will show you to your room, Clara. We can discuss everything else over supper." As Tom led the horses toward the barn, Running Bear gestured for Clara to follow her into the house. The interior was as thoughtfully designed as the exterior, with high ceilings and large windows that would flood the rooms with natural light. During the day, the furniture was well crafted but simple, clearly built to last generations rather than to impress visitors. "This was Sarah's room," Running Bear said, opening a door off the main hallway. "Tom thought you might prefer your own space until you decide how you feel about marriage to a man you've never met." The room was clearly a woman's sanctuary, with delicate floral wallpaper and furniture painted in soft shades of cream and sage green. A window faced east toward the mountains, and Clara could imagine how beautiful the sunrise must look from this vantage point. But what struck her most was the sense of lingering sadness that seemed to permeate every surface. "She died here," Clara said softly, not asking the question but stating a fact she somehow knew to be true. Running Bear's eyes sharpened with surprise and something that might have been approval. "The fever took her and both children in the space of a week. Tom brought doctor after doctor from Denver, but nothing helped. She died in his arms, in this room, asking him to forgive her for leaving." Clara moved to the window, placing her palm against the glass and closing her eyes. Through her heightened senses, she could almost feel the echoes of that terrible time. The desperate prayers, the helpless rage, the crushing weight of loss that had broken a strong man's spirit. "He blames himself," she said quietly. "As do all who survive when those they love do not," Running Bear replied. "But blame is like a poison that spreads through the soul if not cleansed away. Tom has been carrying his poison for 3 years now. It has made him hard where he should be, soft and fearful where he should be brave." Clara turned to face the older woman, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who understood both healing and the complexities of human nature. "And what do you think of his decision to marry a stranger?" "I think," Running Bear said carefully, "that sometimes the spirits send us what we need in forms we do not expect. I think you did not come here by accident, Clara Bennett, and I think you carry more than herbs in that small pouch you wear." The directness of the statement took Clara's breath away. She had spent months perfecting the art of hiding her true nature, of appearing ordinary and unremarkable to anyone who might look too closely. Yet this woman had seen through her carefully constructed facade within minutes of their meeting. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though the words sounded unconvincing even to her own ears. Running Bear smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features with unexpected warmth. "Peace, child. Your secrets are safe with me. I have seen enough of the world to know that some gifts are given by the Great Spirit, and those who carry them must choose carefully when and how to use them." Before Clara could respond, Tom's voice called from the kitchen, announcing that supper was ready. Running Bear moved toward the door, then paused to look back at her unexpected guest. "One more thing," she said quietly. "This house has been waiting for someone to fill it with life again. But healing Tom's heart will require more than herbs and potions. It will require you to trust him with the truth about who you really are. With that cryptic advice, she disappeared down the hallway, leaving Clara alone with her racing thoughts and the weight of decisions that would affect not just her own future, but the fate of everyone in Cedar Falls. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Sarah's former room, cast in delicate patterns across the wooden floor as Clara woke to the sound of distant voices raised in concern. She dressed quickly in one of her practical work dresses, pinning her auburn hair into a neat bun before making her way toward the kitchen where the conversation seemed to be centered. Tom stood by the window with Dr. Hayes, both men's faces grim as they discussed something in hushed tones. Running Bear moved efficiently around the kitchen, preparing what looked like enough breakfast for several additional people, her movements carrying the urgency of someone expecting difficult news. The Henderson family? Tom was saying, his scarred hand clenched around a cup of coffee. All of them? Martha and both the little ones came down with it overnight, Dr. Hayes replied wearily. Same symptoms as the Patterson child, but progressing much faster. I've never seen anything quite like it. High fever, severe respiratory distress, and a strange rash that appears and disappears without warning. Clara paused in the doorway, her medical instincts immediately alert. The combination of symptoms Dr. Hayes described was unusual, suggesting either a new strain of disease or perhaps multiple conditions affecting the victim simultaneously. Her trained mind began cataloging possibilities, drawing on years of experience with illnesses that conventional medicine couldn't always explain or treat. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle the men from their intense discussion. Tom turned toward her, and she noticed the dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd slept little if at all. "Clara, I'm sorry you had to wake up to this kind of news." Doc Hayes came by early with word about more sickness in town. "How many people are affected now?" she asked, accepting the cup of tea that Running Bear silently placed in her hands. 7 children and 3 adults, Dr. Hayes replied, studying her face with that same professional interest she'd noticed the day before. "All from different families, no obvious connection between them, except that they've all been in town within the last week. I'm beginning to worry we might be dealing with some kind of epidemic." Clara sipped her tea thoughtfully, her mind already working through the diagnostic possibilities. "Dr. Hayes, have you noticed any pattern in where these families live, or what they might have in common? Sometimes diseases follow water sources or food supplies." "That's exactly what I've been trying to figure out," he admitted. "But the affected families live in different parts of town, use different wells, buy supplies from different stores. The only thing they all share is that they've been to the weekly market in the town square. What about the vendors at the market?" Clara pressed gently. "Are any of them showing similar symptoms?" Dr. Hayes paused, clearly impressed by her line of questioning. "Now that you mention it, no. The vendors all seem perfectly healthy, which is strange considering they're there every week interacting with dozens of people." Running Bear set a plate of biscuits on the table and spoke without looking up from her work. "Sometimes sickness comes not from what people touch, but from what touches them. The spirits of the land can be disturbed by those who take without giving back." Tom's expression darkened at her words. "If you're talking about Crawford and his men, they've been surveying all over the valley recently, tramping through people's gardens, testing soil samples, making marks on trees and fence posts." "Vincent Crawford?" Clara asked, recognizing the name from conversations she'd overheard on the stagecoach journey. "Land speculator from Denver," Tom explained, his voice tight with anger. "He's been trying to buy up failing ranches and farms for the last 6 months, claiming he wants to help folks who are struggling. But his offers are barely enough to cover existing debts, and he gets angry when people refuse to sell." Dr. Hayes nodded grimly. "He's been pressuring the town council too. saying Cedar Falls needs to embrace progress and stop clinging to outdated ways of making a living. Some folks are starting to listen to him, especially after losing crops and livestock. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. In her experience, men like Crawford often brought more than economic pressure to bear when their initial offers were refused. Has anyone gotten sick who hasn't had contact with his surveying activities? The question seemed to surprise both men. Tom set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Now that you mention it, the families who've fallen ill all have property that Crawford's been particularly interested in. The Hendersons own the best water rights in the valley, and the Pattersons have land right along the proposed railroad route. That could still be coincidence, Dr. Hayes said, though his tone suggested he was beginning to have doubts. Disease doesn't usually follow property lines or business interests. No, Clara agreed quietly, but men with bad intentions sometimes use whatever tools are available to them, including things that can make people sick. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Running Bear looked up from her cooking with an expression of grim satisfaction, as if Clara had finally voiced suspicions she'd been harboring for some time. You're suggesting someone might be deliberately poisoning people? Tom asked, his scarred face showing a mixture of disbelief and growing fury. I'm suggesting that when people suddenly fall ill with mysterious symptoms after refusing to sell their land to a persistent buyer, it might be worth investigating all possibilities, Clara replied carefully. Especially when the pattern of illness seems to follow economic rather than medical logic. Dr. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his medical bag at his feet, seeming to mock his inability to help his patients. If you're right, then conventional treatments won't work because we're not dealing with a natural disease. But how could we prove such a thing? Clara felt the familiar stirring in her chest, the call to usability she'd spent months learning to suppress. Every instinct told her that these people needed help she could provide, but revealing her true nature would put not only herself at risk, but potentially everyone in Cedar Falls who might be accused of harboring someone with supernatural abilities. Sometimes, she said slowly, choosing each word with care, traditional remedies can be effective against conditions that resist modern medicine. My grandmother used to say that plants have their own wisdom about healing, and they don't always follow the rules doctors learn from books. Running Bear nodded approvingly. The old ways often work when new ways fail. But such healing requires knowledge that has been passed down through generations, and trust between the healer and those who seek help. Tom studied Clara's face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he was seeing past her carefully maintained facade to something deeper beneath. You're not just a farmer's daughter who learned some folk remedies, are you? The directness of his question caught her off guard. She had expected to have more time to establish herself in the community before anyone began questioning her background too closely. But the crisis facing Cedar Falls seemed to be accelerating everything, forcing choices she wasn't ready to make. I'm someone who believes that everyone deserves a chance to live without fear, she replied, which was true even if it wasn't the complete answer he was seeking. And I'm someone who can't stand by and watch children suffer when I might be able to help. Dr. Hayes stood up abruptly, his decision apparently made. Miss Bennett, I don't care if you learned your healing from books, from your grandmother, or from voices in the wind. If you think you can help those children, then I'm willing to try anything you suggest. It might mean working outside conventional medical practice, Clara warned. Some people might not understand or approve of methods that seem unconventional. Some people might not understand or approve of children dying while adults debate medical philosophy, Dr. Hayes countered firmly. What do you need from me? Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward this kind man who was willing to risk his professional reputation to save lives. First, I need to see the patients myself. Not as a doctor, but as someone who might recognize signs that medical training doesn't usually address. and I need access to whatever supplies Crawford and his men might have left behind in their surveying activities. Tom pushed back from the table, his expression resolute despite the obvious pain in his injured shoulder. I can show you where they've been working. And if we find evidence that they're responsible for this sickness, Crawford will answer for it. Tom, Running Bear said quietly, her voice carrying warning, anger is a weapon that wounds the one who wields it as much as the target. If you seek justice, do it with a clear mind and clean hands. Some things are worth getting angry about, Tom replied, but Clara noticed he didn't argue with the older woman's wisdom. As they prepared to ride into town, Clara packed her leather satchel with carefully selected herbs and remedies, trying to choose items that would appear conventional enough not to raise questions while still being effective against whatever was causing the mysterious illness. Running Bear watched her preparations with knowing eyes. You carry more than plants in that bag, the older woman observed quietly while Tom was outside preparing the horses. Everyone carries more than what shows on the surface, Clara replied diplomatically. True, but some carry gifts that could save lives, while others carry secrets that could destroy them. Wisdom lies in knowing which is which. Before Clara could respond, Tom returned to announce that the horses were ready. As they prepared to leave, Running Bear caught Clara's arm gently. The children's suffering calls to you, she said, so quietly that Tom couldn't overhear. I can see it in your eyes, the way a mother's pain calls to another mother. Trust what your heart tells you to do, but be careful who you trust with the knowledge of how you do it. The ride into Cedar Falls revealed a town transformed by fear and suspicion. Where yesterday Clara had seen resignation and quiet desperation, today she witnessed something more dangerous. Neighbors eyeing each other with distrust, families barricading themselves in their homes, and the kind of tension that could explode into violence if the right spark was applied. Dr. Hayes met them outside his medical practice, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent tending patients he couldn't help. 2 more families came to me this morning, he reported grimly. The Johnson twins and old Mrs. Whitfield. The pattern is getting harder to ignore. Every person affected has refused Crawford's offers to buy their property. They entered the doctor's office together, and Clara was immediately struck by the smell of fear and sickness that permeated the air. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of suffering, children crying, adults moaning with fever, and the desperate murmurs of family members keeping vigil beside sickbeds. Can I see them? Clara asked, her professional instincts overwhelming her caution. Dr. Hayes nodded and led her to the first room, where a young mother sat beside a bed holding a child who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The little girl's face was flushed with fever, her breathing labored and irregular. But what caught Clara's attention most was the strange quality of her skin. It seemed almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface in patterns that suggested toxicity rather than natural illness. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Hayes said gently, this is Clara Bennett. She has experience with childhood fevers and might be able to suggest some additional treatments. The desperate mother looked up with eyes red from crying and sleepless nights. Please, she whispered, I'll try anything. The medicine isn't helping, and she's getting worse every hour. Clara knelt beside the bed and placed her hand gently on the child's forehead. The moment her skin made contact, she felt the familiar surge of awareness that told her exactly what was wrong. The little girl had been poisoned, but not with any conventional toxin. Someone had used a combination of plants and minerals that would mimic natural disease while slowly destroying the body's ability to fight infection. Has she been near any unusual plants recently? Clara asked, already knowing the answer but needing to establish a logical explanation for her diagnosis. Sometimes children pick flowers or berries that can make them very sick. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. She hasn't been anywhere except the market last week, and she never leaves my sight when we're in town. Clara nodded thoughtfully, her mind racing through treatment options that would be both effective and explainable. "Dr. Hayes, do you have activated charcoal in your supplies? And perhaps some milk thistle if you can find it?" "I have charcoal," he confirmed. "But milk thistle is harder to come by. Why do you ask?" "The symptoms suggest some kind of toxin in her system," Clara explained, which was perfectly true. "Charcoal can help absorb poisons before they do. More damage, and milk thistle supports the liver's natural detoxification processes." As Dr. Hayes went to gather the requested supplies, Clara placed both hands on the child's chest, closing her eyes and allowing her awareness to expand. Through her enhanced senses, she could feel the poison spreading through the little girl's system like dark threads, attacking organs and disrupting natural processes. But she could also sense the child's innate strength, the life force that was fighting desperately against the toxin's effects. Working as subtly as she could, Clara began to channel healing energy through her hands, targeting the poison directly and supporting the child's natural defenses. It was delicate work, requiring her to help the body heal itself rather than forcing dramatic changes that would be impossible to explain. Within minutes, the little girl's breathing began to ease and some color returned to her cheeks. Mrs. Henderson gasped in amazement, reaching out to touch her daughter's face. "The fever's breaking," she whispered. "How is that possible?" "Sometimes. The right combination of treatments can help turn the tide," Clara replied, withdrawing her hands carefully. "But you need continued care and monitoring to make sure the improvement continues." Dr. Hayes returned with the activated charcoal just in time to witness the child's obvious improvement. His eyes widened as he took in the dramatic change in his young patient's condition. "Remarkable," he murmured, checking the little girl's pulse and temperature. "I've never seen such a rapid response to treatment. What exactly did you do?" "I helped her body remember how to fight," Clara replied, which was as close to the truth as she dared come. Sometimes healing is less about adding medicines and more about removing obstacles to the body's natural processes. They moved through the other rooms, and Clara repeated her careful work with each patient, always maintaining the pretense of using conventional treatments while actually channeling healing energy directly into their systems. By midday, every person affected by the mysterious illness was showing marked improvement, and word was beginning to spread through Cedar Falls that a miracle was occurring at Dr. Hayes' practice. Tom watched the proceedings with growing amazement and suspicion. Clara could feel his eyes on her as she worked, studying her methods and obviously struggling to understand how she achieved such consistent results with techniques that seemed simple and natural. "We need to talk," he said quietly as they prepared to leave the medical practice. Privately, Clara felt her heart sink, knowing that her carefully maintained cover was beginning to crack under the pressure of using her abilities so openly. But the children's lives had been at stake, and she couldn't regret the choice to help them, regardless of the consequences for herself. They rode in silence toward the area where Crawford's surveying teams had been working most recently, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape around them showed obvious signs of disturbance, soil samples taken from multiple locations, trees marked with strange symbols, and equipment tracks that crisscrossed the valley floor in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. "Look at this," Tom said, dismounting near a grove of elderberry bushes that showed signs of having been harvested recently. "Someone's been cutting branches and stripping bark, but not in the way you'd do it if you were gathering medicine." Clara examined the damaged plants with growing alarm. The cuts were precise and systematic, designed to extract specific compounds, rather than preserve the health of the plants. Combined with evidence of other harvesting activities in the area, it painted a disturbing picture of someone with extensive knowledge of toxic plants, using that knowledge for harmful purposes. "This isn't the work of surveyors," she said grimly. "Someone with training in botanical medicine has been gathering ingredients for poison, and they knew exactly which combinations would create symptoms that would mimic natural disease." Tom's scarred face hardened with fury. Crawford. Or someone working for him, Clara agreed. But proving it will be another matter entirely. As they prepared to gather evidence of the illegal harvesting, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Crawford and 3 of his men were riding toward them at a steady pace, their faces showing the confident expressions of men who believe themselves untouchable. "Well, well," Crawford called out as he drew near. "If it isn't the grieving widower and his mail-order bride, trespassing on surveyed land. This area is under consideration for development, which makes your presence here a legal matter. Vincent." Crawford was a man in his 40s, well-dressed and well-fed, with the kind of soft features that spoke of a life spent in offices rather than under the open sky. But his eyes held a coldness that Clara had learned to associate with men who viewed other people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings to be respected. "This is still my land, Crawford," Tom replied evenly, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "Your survey markers don't change legal ownership." "Legal ownership can be a surprisingly fluid concept," Crawford smiled, dismounting with theatrical casualness, "especially when properties carry debts that exceed their current market value. I understand you've had some expensive veterinary problems recently." Clara studied Crawford's 3 companions, noting details that others might miss. One carried himself like a man accustomed to violence, with scars on his knuckles and a gun worn low on his hip. The second had stains under his fingernails that could be plant matter, and a small collection of glass vials tucked into his vest pocket. The third watched everything with the calculating gaze of someone gathering information for future use. "Interesting timing for a social visit," Clara said pleasantly, though her hand had moved unconsciously toward the herb pouch beneath her dress. "Just as families all over the valley happen to be recovering from a mysterious illness." Crawford's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. Illness can be so unpredictable, can't it? One day a family is perfectly healthy, and the next they're facing medical bills that could bankrupt them. Fortunate that recovery can be just as sudden and unexpected. The threat in his words was unmistakable, though carefully veiled in language that could be interpreted as mere observation. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she realized just how dangerous this man truly was. Recovery tends to be more predictable when people have access to proper medical care, she replied carefully, "and when they're not exposed to things that shouldn't be in their environment. Miss Bennett, isn't it?" Crawford studied her with new interest. "I hear you've been quite helpful to Dr. Hayes today. Such impressive results for someone with no formal medical training. One might almost call them miraculous." Clara's blood ran cold at the implication behind his words. Somehow, Crawford had already learned about her success in treating the poisoned families, and his tone suggested he suspected more than just folk remedies were involved. "Knowledge has a way of traveling," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "especially when it comes from generations of women who understood plants and healing." "Indeed," Crawford nodded thoughtfully, "though sometimes knowledge can be dangerous, particularly in communities that aren't ready to accept unconventional methods. History is full of examples of healers who faced unfortunate consequences when their abilities exceeded what their neighbors considered natural." The veiled threat sent ice through Clara's veins, but before she could respond, Tom stepped forward with deadly calm. "Are you threatening my intended wife, Crawford?" "Merely making an observation about the challenges faced by those with unusual talents," Crawford replied smoothly. "Though I suppose a man in your position might be sensitive about losing another woman to circumstances beyond his control." The words hit Tom like physical blows, and Clara saw his right hand move instinctively toward the gun he wore. Crawford's men tensed in response, hands drifting toward their own weapons. "Easy, gentlemen," Crawford said, though his smile had taken on a predatory quality. No need for violence when civilized conversation can accomplish so much more. Clara stepped between Tom and Crawford, placing a calming hand on Tom's arm while keeping her eyes fixed on the land speculator. "Mr. Crawford, I think you've made your position quite clear. Perhaps it would be best if you continued your business elsewhere." "Oh, but my business is here," Crawford replied silkily, "with people who understand the value of cooperation and the cost of resistance. I trust both of you will consider our conversation carefully in the coming days." As Crawford and his men rode away, Clara felt the weight of a much larger and more dangerous conflict settling around them. The healing of the children had been only the beginning. Now she and Tom were facing an enemy who combined economic pressure with medical knowledge and wasn't afraid to use both against innocent families. "He knows," Tom said quietly, his voice tight with controlled anger, "about what you did for those children today. And he knows it wasn't just conventional medicine." Clara nodded, her mind already racing through options and consequences. "The question is what he plans to do with that knowledge, and whether we can stop him before he uses it to hurt more people." As they rode back toward the ranch, the setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and ominous at the same time. Clara realized that her carefully planned new life was about to become something much more complicated and dangerous than she had ever imagined. But she also knew that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you never planned to fight, and that running from responsibility was not an option when innocent lives hung in the balance. That evening, Clara found herself standing in the kitchen garden behind the ranch house, her hands working automatically through the familiar motions of harvesting herbs by moonlight. The silvery illumination revealed plants she hadn't noticed during daylight hours, medicinal varieties that grew wild among the vegetables, as if the earth itself understood what would be needed in times of crisis. Running Bear emerged from the shadows like a spirit materializing from the night air. "The old woman who lived here before Sarah knew the healing ways," she said quietly, settling onto a wooden crate that served as a makeshift chair. "She planted these gardens with intention, not just beauty." Clara continued her work, grateful for the older woman's presence and the opportunity to speak without pretense. Tom's grandmother? His great-aunt, actually. Martha Mitchell came west when this was still wild territory, carrying seeds and knowledge that kept families alive through brutal winters and summer droughts. "She taught me much about the plants that grow in this valley before the fever took her." The mention of fever made Clara pause in her harvesting. The same sickness that killed Tom's family? No, Running Bear's voice carried the weight of old grief. That was different, meaner. The fever that took Martha was natural, the kind that comes with age and worn-out bodies. But what killed Sarah and the children? She trailed off, her weathered hands working nervously at the silver ornaments in her hair. Clara turned to face her fully, sensing that crucial information was about to be shared. "You suspected something was wrong even then, didn't you?" 3 years ago, Crawford first came to the valley with his promises and his smooth words. Most folks were struggling, grateful for any offer of help. But there were 5 families who refused his initial proposals: the Mitchells, the Hendersons, the Pattersons, the Johnsons, and the Whitfields. Clara felt ice forming in her stomach as she recognized all the names from the recent wave of mysterious illnesses. And then the fever struck. Sarah and her children died first. Tom was so consumed with grief, he couldn't think clearly about anything else. The other families rallied around him, brought food and comfort, helped with the ranch work. Running Bear's voice grew harder. Within 6 months, all but the Hendersons had sold their land to Crawford for a fraction of its worth. They couldn't afford to rebuild after losing livestock to various accidents and equipment breakdowns that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency. Clara absorbed this information, her mind connecting patterns that painted an even darker picture of Crawford's methods than she had initially suspected. "But you never had proof of his involvement." "Proof is a white man's concept," Running Bear replied with a slight smile that held no warmth. "My people understand that some truths are felt in the bones and spirit rather than seen with the eyes. Crawford is a man who brings sickness wherever he goes, not just to bodies but to the harmony of communities. The sound of approaching footsteps made both women turn toward the house. Tom emerged onto the back porch, his silhouette framed against the warm light spilling from the kitchen windows. Even from a distance, Clara could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he favored his injured side. "Clara," he called softly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" She gathered the herbs she'd been collecting, wrapping them carefully in a piece of cloth before making her way toward the porch. Running Bear remained in the garden, but Clara could feel the older woman's watchful presence like a protective shield at her back. "You saved those children today," Tom said without preamble, his storm-gray eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "But not the way Dr. Hayes thinks you did, and not the way you want everyone to believe." Clara had been expecting this conversation since their encounter with Crawford, but the directness of Tom's approach still caught her slightly off guard. "What do you think you know about how I helped them?" "I think," Tom said carefully, moving closer until they stood just beyond touching distance, "that you have abilities most people would consider impossible. I think you can heal with your hands in ways that have nothing to do with conventional medicine. And I think you're terrified of what will happen if anyone else figures out what I've already guessed." The accuracy of his assessment left Clara momentarily speechless. She had spent months perfecting the art of deflection and misdirection, yet this battle-scarred rancher had seen through her carefully constructed facade with unsettling ease. "And what if you're right?" she asked quietly. "What would you do with that knowledge?" Tom was silent for a long moment, his scarred face reflecting an internal struggle that seemed to mirror her own. "3 years ago, I would have called you a fraud or a witch, depending on my mood. I was a different man then, sure of what was possible and what wasn't, confident that the world operated according to rules I understood." He touched the jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a gesture that had become habitual when he was thinking deeply. "But losing Sarah and the children broke something inside me, Clara. Broke my faith in medicine, in God, in the basic fairness of existence. If Dr. Hayes and all his training couldn't save them, if prayers and desperate bargaining with the Almighty couldn't save them, then what good were any of the rules I thought governed the world?" Clara felt her heart constrict at the raw pain in his voice. "Tom, I'm sorry. I can't imagine what that loss must have felt like. Can't you?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair. "I think you understand loss better than most people. I think something terrible happened to you, something that made you leave your old life behind and travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger." The perceptiveness of his observation shook her more than she cared to admit. "Everyone has reasons for starting over. True, but not everyone carries the kind of careful control you have, the way you watch every word and guard every expression. That comes from surviving something that taught you to be afraid of your own nature." Clara found herself caught between the desire to confess everything and the ingrained habit of concealment that had kept her safe for so long. "You're asking me to trust you with something that could get me killed, Tom. In some places, people like me are still burned at stakes or hanged from trees. And you're asking me to trust you with my heart after I've already lost everyone I ever loved," Tom replied softly. "Seems like we're both taking risks here." The honesty in his words cut through her defenses like a knife through silk. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, Clara allowed herself to truly look at this man, not as a convenient arrangement or a safe harbor, but as a human being who had suffered losses that rivaled her own. "If I tell you the truth," she said slowly, "everything changes between us. There's no going back to pretending I'm just a farm girl who learned some folk remedies from her grandmother." "Everything's already changed," Tom replied. "The moment you put your hands on those sick children and brought them back from the edge of death, everything changed." The only question now is whether we face whatever comes next together or separately." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a decision that would affect not just her own future, but potentially the lives of everyone in Cedar Falls. When she opened them again, Tom was still watching her with patient intensity, waiting for her to choose trust over fear. "I can heal people," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not with herbs or potions or any kind of conventional medicine, though I know about those things too. I can channel energy through my hands, guide the body's natural healing processes, sometimes even reverse damage that doctors would consider irreversible." Tom nodded slowly, as if her confession confirmed suspicions he'd been harboring all day. "How long have you been able to do this?" "Since I was a child. It started small, cuts that healed faster when I touched them, headaches that disappeared. When I placed my hands on someone's forehead, my grandmother recognized what was happening and taught me to hide it, to make it seem like I was using conventional remedies." Clara's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But as I got older, the ability became more powerful. I could sense illnesses before symptoms appeared, feel the flow of life energy in living things, sometimes even communicate with animals in ways that went beyond normal understanding. And people found out. In my hometown back in Pennsylvania, yes. I made the mistake of healing a child who'd been trampled by a horse, bringing him back from injuries that should have been fatal. Word spread, and soon I had desperate families coming to me with loved ones that conventional medicine couldn't help." Clara's hands clenched involuntarily at the memory. "For a while, I thought it was a blessing. I was helping people, saving lives, making a difference in ways that felt meaningful and important. But it went wrong," Tom guessed, his voice gentle with understanding. "The local pastor decided I was practicing witchcraft. He convinced enough people that I was dangerous, that my abilities came from dark sources rather than divine ones. They came for me one night, a mob with torches and ropes and absolutely no interest in hearing explanations." Clara's voice grew hard with remembered fear. "I had to leave everything behind and run, knowing I could never go back." Tom reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and took her hands in his own. The contact sent familiar tingles through her awareness, but for once she didn't try to suppress the sensation. "How many people know about your abilities now?" he asked. "You, and I suspect Running Bear has guessed. Dr. Hayes might have suspicions, but he's more focused on results than methods. And Crawford," she shuddered slightly. "Crawford knows something isn't normal about what happened today, and men like him tend to be dangerous when they encounter things they can't control or profit from. Then we need to be very careful about how we handle whatever comes next," Tom said pragmatically. "Because if Crawford is responsible for the poisonings, and if he suspects you can undo his work, he's not going to just give up and leave town." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses broke the relative quiet of the evening. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his gun, though Clara noticed he winced slightly at the movement. His old injuries clearly caused him more pain than he was willing to admit. "Stay behind me," he said, positioning himself between Clara and the approaching riders. "Tom," she said softly, "I'm not helpless. And hiding behind you won't protect me if Crawford really knows what he thinks he knows." The riders resolved into three figures as they drew closer to the house: Dr. Hayes, Sheriff Williams, and a man Clara didn't recognize who wore the kind of expensive clothes that suggested he was someone of importance. "Tom, Clara," Dr. Hayes called out as they approached. "Sorry to disturb you so late, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention." Sheriff Williams, a man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors, dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose joints no longer bent as easily as they once had. "Evening. Folks, this here is Judge Morrison from the Territorial Courthouse. He's got some questions about today's medical treatments." Judge Morrison was perhaps 40 years old, with the soft features and pale complexion of a man who spent his time in courtrooms rather than under the open sky. But his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to sifting truth from lies and making decisions that affected people's lives. "Miss Bennett," the judge said formally, "I've received some concerning reports about unusual medical practices being employed in Cedar Falls. Reports that suggest treatments were administered without proper licensing or oversight." Clara felt her blood turn to ice water. Crawford had moved faster than she'd expected, using legal channels to attack her before she could establish herself more firmly in the community. "Judge Morrison," Tom said evenly, though Clara could hear the controlled anger in his voice. "Clara Bennett helped save the lives of 7 children today when conventional medicine had failed. I'd hardly call that a concerning development." "The concern, Mr. Mitchell, is not with the results, but with the methods," Judge Morrison replied smoothly. "Practicing medicine without proper credentials is illegal in this territory, regardless of outcomes. And there are additional allegations about the use of unconventional techniques that may violate territorial statutes regarding superstitious practices." The carefully chosen language made Clara's stomach clench with recognition. She had heard similar phrases used in Pennsylvania legal terminology that allowed authorities to prosecute people for witchcraft without actually using the word. "Judge," Dr. Hayes interjected, his voice carrying professional authority, "I was present during all of Miss Bennett's treatments today. She used nothing but conventional remedies, activated charcoal, supportive care, and folk knowledge about healing plants. Everything she did was well within the bounds of traditional medicine. And yet the recovery rate was remarkable, wasn't it, Doctor?" Judge Morrison's tone remained pleasant, but Clara could hear the trap being constructed in his words. "Some might say miraculously so. Some might say that's what happens when the right treatments are applied at the right time," Dr. Hayes countered firmly. "Miss Bennett has extensive knowledge about plant-based remedies that complemented my own medical training perfectly." Sheriff Williams looked uncomfortable with the entire conversation, his eyes darting between the various participants, as if trying to gauge which way the political winds were blowing. "Judge, I've known Dr. Hayes for 20 years, and if he says the treatments were legitimate, that carries a lot of weight with me." "Sheriff Williams, I appreciate your confidence in Dr. Hayes," Judge Morrison replied with the patience of a man accustomed to dealing with local officials who didn't understand the larger political picture. "But we must also consider the testimony of concerned citizens who worry about the influence of unregulated healing practices in their community." Clara felt the walls closing in around her with terrifying familiarity. Crawford had orchestrated this encounter perfectly, using legal pressure to force a confrontation while maintaining plausible deniability about his own involvement. "What exactly are you alleging, Judge Morrison?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the fear racing through her veins. "I'm not alleging anything at this time, Miss Bennett. I'm simply investigating reports and determining whether further action is necessary." His smile held all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. "However, I do think it would be prudent for you to accompany me back to town so we can discuss these matters in a more official capacity." "She's not going anywhere without proper charges being filed," Tom said flatly, his hand moving closer to his gun in a gesture that made Sheriff Williams tense visibly. "Tom," Clara said quietly, "don't make this worse than it already is." "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Morrison said with exaggerated reasonableness, "I understand your desire to protect your intended bride, but interfering with a legal investigation would be most unwise." Running Bear appeared at Clara's shoulder with the silent suddenness that seemed to be her trademark. "The woman has harmed no one and helped many," she said in her careful English. "Why do you bring legal troubles to those who bring healing?" Judge Morrison's expression shifted slightly at Running Bear's appearance, taking on the particular kind of condescension that Clara had learned to recognize in officials who considered themselves more civilized than the people they governed. Madam, I'm sure you mean well, but legal matters require more sophisticated understanding than traditional perspectives can provide, he said dismissively. Traditional perspectives understand that justice and law are not always the same thing. Running Bear replied with dignity that made the judge's condescension seem petty by comparison. Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of submitting to the judge's demands or allowing the situation to escalate into violence, she stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who had finally decided to stop running. Judge Morrison, I'll be happy to discuss my healing methods with you, but I think the conversation should include everyone who has a stake in the outcome. If there are concerns about my practices, then the entire community should hear both the accusations and my responses. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly at her unexpected assertiveness. Miss Bennett, legal proceedings aren't typically conducted as public spectacles. Then perhaps, Clara said with a smile that matched his own for false pleasantness, we should consider whether legal proceedings are actually necessary. After all, no one has been harmed by my actions, and several families have been helped significantly. Unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing rather than mere suspicion, I'm not sure what law you believe has been broken. Tom looked at her with surprise and something that might have been admiration. Clara has a point, Judge. What specific statute are you claiming has been violated? Judge Morrison's smooth confidence faltered slightly as he realized that Clara wasn't going to be intimidated into compliance. There are territorial regulations about medical practice and concerns about activities that might be considered outside the bounds of Christian conduct. Healing sick children is outside the bounds of Christian conduct? Dr. Hayes asked, with barely concealed incredulity. I seem to recall that Christ himself was known for similar activities. The theological challenge clearly wasn't what Judge Morrison had been expecting. Doctor, we're not discussing religious philosophy here, aren't we? Clara asked quietly. Because it seems to me that questioning healing activities on religious grounds is exactly what we're discussing. Sheriff Williams cleared his throat uncomfortably. Judge, maybe we should table this conversation until tomorrow when everyone's had time to think things through. It's been a long day, and emotions are running high. An excellent suggestion, Tom agreed firmly. Clara isn't going anywhere, and if there are legitimate concerns to be addressed, they can be handled during daylight hours when the whole community can participate in the discussion. Judge Morrison clearly wasn't pleased with the way the conversation had developed, but he seemed to recognize that pushing the issue further tonight wouldn't serve his purposes. Very well, but Miss Bennett, I trust you understand that these matters require resolution. The territorial government takes illegal medical practice very seriously. As seriously as it takes the illegal poisoning of families. Clara asked, with deceptive mildness. The question hit Judge Morrison like a physical blow, his composed expression cracking to reveal something much less pleasant beneath. I'm not sure what you're implying, Miss Bennett. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating directly that someone has been systematically poisoning families in Cedar Falls, using knowledge of toxic plants to create symptoms that mimic natural disease. If the territorial government is truly concerned about illegal medical practices, perhaps it should investigate the source of these mysterious illnesses rather than harassing the people who are trying to cure them. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Dr. Hayes stared at her with dawning understanding, while Sheriff Williams's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Even Tom seemed surprised by her direct challenge to what everyone had been thinking, but no one had been willing to say aloud. That's a serious accusation, Judge Morrison said carefully, his voice tight with controlled anger. Yes, it is, Clara agreed calmly. And I'm prepared to provide evidence to support it. Assuming the territorial government is actually interested in justice rather than simply silencing inconvenient witnesses. Judge Morrison's mask slipped entirely for just a moment, revealing the calculating opportunist beneath the judicial facade. But he recovered quickly, professional composure sliding back into place like armor donned for battle. "Miss Bennett, I think you may be letting your emotions cloud your judgment. These are complex matters that require careful investigation rather than wild accusations." "Then let's investigate," Clara replied with steel in her voice. "Let's examine the evidence of plant harvesting in areas where Crawford's men have been surveying. Let's talk to the families who've been poisoned and see if they can identify any patterns in their experiences. Let's find out who has the knowledge and resources to create the specific combination of toxins that were used." Tom stepped up beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "That sounds like a reasonable approach to me, Judge, unless there's some reason you'd prefer not to pursue that line of inquiry." The battle lines had been drawn, Clara realized, and the pretense of legal propriety was beginning to crumble under the pressure of direct confrontation. Whatever happened next would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the future of everyone in Cedar Falls. Judge Morrison gathered his reins with deliberate precision, his movements controlled but betraying underlying tension. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Mitchell, I think you may be underestimating the complexity of the situation you're involving yourselves in. Some forces are larger and more powerful than individual communities can successfully resist. And some communities are stronger and more resilient than outside forces expect," Tom replied evenly. "I guess we'll find out which is which." As the three men rode away into the darkness, Clara felt the weight of consequences settling around her like a heavy cloak. By choosing to fight rather than submit or flee, she had committed herself and everyone around her to a conflict that would test not only her healing abilities, but her courage and wisdom as well. Running Bear placed a weathered hand on Clara's shoulder. "The die is cast, as the white soldiers like to say. Now we discover whether courage and truth are stronger than corruption and fear." Tom moved to Clara's other side, his presence warm and solid in the cooling night air. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Standing by each other when the storms come." Clara looked up at him with surprise, realizing that somewhere in the course of their confrontation with legal authority, her arrangement of convenience had become something deeper and more significant. "Are you proposing to me, Thomas Mitchell?" "I'm stating a fact," he replied with a slight smile that transformed his scarred features. "We're already bound together, by choices we've made and secrets we've shared. The ceremony is just a formality at this point." As they walked back toward the house together, Clara realized that her carefully planned escape from her past had become something entirely different, a commitment to fight for a future that included not just her own safety, but the well-being of an entire community that had accepted her despite her differences. The real battle was just beginning, and she had no idea what it would cost any of them before it was over. Dawn arrived gray and ominous over Cedar Falls, with clouds gathering on the horizon that promised more than just rain. Clara woke to the sound of urgent voices in the kitchen and the distinctive creak of wagon wheels approaching the house at speed. She dressed quickly, her instincts already alert to the possibility of crisis. When she entered the kitchen, she found Tom speaking in hushed tones with a young cowboy she recognized as Billy Henderson, whose family had been among those affected by the mysterious poisoning. The young man's face was pale with exhaustion and fear, his clothes dusty from what appeared to be a hard ride. "Miss Clara," Billy said, rising respectfully when he saw her. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, but we got troubles in town." "Big troubles?" Tom's scarred face was grim as he poured coffee for their unexpected visitor. "Tell her what you told me, Billy." The young man accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped them around the warm cup. "It's my little sister Emma, and the Johnson twins, and Mrs. Whitfield. They all took sick again during the night, worse than before. But this time it's different. They're not just fevered and weak. They're having fits, seeing things that ain't there, screaming about shadows coming to take them away. Clara felt ice forming in her stomach. The symptoms Billy described weren't consistent with the plant-based toxins that had been used before. This sounded like something much more dangerous, possibly even designed to counteract her previous healing work. Where are they now? She asked, already moving toward her medical supplies. Doc Hayes has them at his place, but he sent me to fetch you. Says he's never seen anything like it, and the usual treatments ain't working at all. Billy's voice cracked with emotion. My ma's beside herself with worry. Emma was getting better yesterday, laughing and playing like normal. Now she's burning up with fever and talking to people who ain't there. Tom reached for his gun belt, his expression resolute. I'll saddle the horses. Tom, wait, Clara said, placing the gentle hand on his arm. This feels like a trap. The timing is too convenient, coming right after last night's confrontation with Judge Morrison. You think Crawford would poison children again just to force you into town? Tom's voice carried controlled fury at the possibility. I think Crawford is capable of anything if it serves his purposes, Clara replied grimly. But whether it's a trap or not, those children need help. I can't let them suffer because I'm afraid of what might happen to me. Running Bear appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. The spirits have been restless all night, she said quietly. Something dark moves through the valley, bringing sickness that comes not from the earth, but from the twisted intentions of evil men. Clara nodded, understanding the older woman's meaning. Whatever's been used this time isn't natural. It's something created specifically to cause suffering, and possibly to force me into a situation where my abilities will be exposed beyond any possibility of explanation. Then we go in prepared for whatever Crawford has planned, Tom said firmly. Billy, ride back to town and tell Doc Hayes we're coming. And tell Sheriff Williams that if anything happens to Clara, he'll answer to me personally. As Billy rode away to deliver the message, Clara packed her supplies with extra care, including items she had hoped never to need again. The small glass vials and crystalline powders she wrapped carefully in protective cloth were not the gentle healing herbs she preferred, but more powerful remedies that worked quickly and left little doubt about their supernatural effectiveness. You're planning to use the full extent of your abilities, Tom observed, watching her preparations with keen attention. If those children are as sick as Billy described, conventional treatments won't be enough to save them, Clara replied simply. And if this is Crawford's attempt to force me into the open, then hiding my true nature won't protect me anyway. Running Bear approached with a small leather pouch that Clara hadn't seen before. These are protections that have been in my family for generations, she said, pressing the pouch into Clara's hands. They will not stop bullets or legal documents, but they may help guard against spiritual attacks and the malevolent intentions of those who work with dark forces. Clara accepted the gift gratefully, sensing immediately that the small objects within the pouch carried genuine power. Whatever Crawford was planning, she would need every advantage she could gather. The ride into Cedar Falls revealed a town transformed by fear and suspicion. Groups of armed men gathered on street corners, their conversation stopping abruptly when Clara and Tom passed. Windows that should have shown warm lamplight remained darkened, and the usual morning bustle of commerce and daily activities was conspicuously absent. They're scared, Tom observed quietly as they approached Dr. Hayes' practice. They should be, Clara replied. Whatever's happening here goes beyond simple poisoning. Someone is deliberately trying to terrorize this community, and they're using sick children as weapons. Dr. Hayes met them at the door of his medical practice, his usually composed demeanor cracked with exhaustion and professional frustration. Clara, thank God you're here. I've tried everything I know, but these new symptoms are unlike anything in my experience. Inside the medical facility, the sounds of suffering were immediately apparent. Children's voices raised in delirium mixed with the desperate murmurs of family members keeping vigil. But underneath the human sounds, Clara detected something else, a wrongness in the very air that made her skin crawl with recognition. "This isn't natural illness," she said quietly to Dr. Hayes. "Someone has introduced something into these children's systems that was designed to cause maximum suffering while resisting conventional treatment. But who would do such a thing?" Dr. Hayes asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Before Clara could respond, Vincent Crawford entered through the front door of the medical practice, flanked by Judge Morrison and two men Clara didn't recognize. One wore the badge of a territorial marshal, while the other had the soft features and expensive clothes of someone accustomed to authority. "Miss Bennett," Crawford said with false concern, "how fortunate that you've arrived so quickly. These poor children are in desperate need of your specialized assistance." Clara felt the trap closing around her with almost physical force. Crawford had orchestrated this entire scenario, using the suffering of innocent children to force her into a position where she would have to reveal her abilities publicly or watch them die. "Mr. Crawford," she replied with carefully controlled calm, "I'm sure you're as concerned as everyone else about finding effective treatment for these children." "Indeed I am." Crawford smiled with predatory satisfaction. "In fact, I've taken the liberty of inviting some observers to witness your healing methods. Territorial Marshal Dawson and Territorial Administrator Phillips are here to ensure that all medical practices employed in Cedar Falls meet appropriate legal standards." Marshal Dawson was a lean man with cold eyes and the weathered appearance of someone accustomed to violence. Administrator Phillips looked like a bureaucrat who had spent his career advancing through political appointments rather than actual competence. Both men studied Clara with the calculating attention of those preparing to make judgments that could destroy lives. "Gentlemen," Dr. Hayes said with professional authority, "this is my medical practice, and I don't recall requesting territorial oversight of my treatment decisions." "Dr. Hayes," Administrator Phillips replied smoothly, "when reports surface of irregular medical practices, the territorial government has both the right and the responsibility to investigate, particularly when those practices may involve activities that fall outside the bounds of conventional Christian medicine." The careful phrasing confirmed Clara's worst fears. Crawford had used his political connections to create an official investigation designed to expose her abilities and provide legal justification for whatever punishment he had planned. Tom stepped closer to Clara, his hand resting casually on his gun butt in a gesture that made Marshal Dawson tense visibly. "Seems like there are a lot of official observers here for what should be a simple medical consultation. Mr. Mitchell," Judge Morrison said with exaggerated reasonableness, "surely you want to ensure that your intended bride receives fair treatment under territorial law. These gentlemen are here to protect everyone's interests." A child's scream from one of the back rooms cut through the political maneuvering, a sound of pure agony that made everyone in the front area freeze. Clara felt the call to healing surge through her system like fire, overwhelming her caution with the desperate need to help. "Enough," she said firmly, pushing past the assembled officials toward the source of the sound. "Children are dying while you play your political games." "Miss Bennett," Marshal Dawson called after her, "you are not to administer any treatments until this investigation is complete." Clara turned to face him with eyes that blazed with barely controlled power. "Marshal, you can investigate all you want after I've saved these children's lives. But if you try to prevent me from helping them, you'll discover that there are some lines even territorial authority shouldn't cross." The raw force of her personality seemed to surprise the marshal, who was clearly accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across his harsh features. Tom moved to Clara's side, his presence solid and reassuring. "The lady's right, Marshal. Whatever legal questions you have can wait until the medical emergency is resolved." "This is highly irregular," Administrator Phillips protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "So is poisoning children to manipulate their families," Clara replied sharply. "But since we're all here, Perhaps we should focus on saving lives first and sorting out legalities later. She entered the first treatment room to find little Emma Henderson writhing in her bed while her parents attempted to hold her still. The child's eyes were wide with terror, her gaze darting frantically around the room as if tracking invisible threats. Her skin had taken on an unhealthy grayish pallor, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. Clara approached the bed slowly, extending her awareness to assess the child's condition. What she sensed made her blood run cold. This wasn't just poisoning, but a deliberate attempt to create symptoms that would force her to use her most powerful abilities in front of witnesses. "What do you see, Emma?" she asked gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Shadows," the little girl whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Dark shadows with reaching hands, trying to pull me into the ground. They say I have to go with them, that I belong to the darkness now." Clara felt rage building in her chest as she recognized the specific combination of toxins and psychological manipulation that had been used. Someone with extensive knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology had designed this particular form of suffering to maximize terror, while creating symptoms that conventional medicine couldn't address. She placed her hands gently on the child's forehead, immediately sensing the complex web of toxins and artificial trauma that had been introduced into the little girl's system. The healing would require her to work at full power, channeling energy in ways that would be impossible to explain or conceal. Behind her, she could hear the assembled officials discussing her actions in hushed tones, but their words faded into background noise as she focused entirely on the child's desperate condition. She began channeling healing energy through her hands, targeting the specific toxins while simultaneously soothing the neurological damage they had caused. The change in Emma's condition was immediate and dramatic. Her breathing steadied, the terror faded from her eyes, and the unnatural pallor began to give way to healthy color. Within minutes, the little girl was sleeping peacefully, her body finally able to rest as the artificial toxins were neutralized. "Remarkable," Administrator Phillips murmured, though his tone suggested suspicion rather than admiration. Clara moved to the next room, where the Johnson twins lay in adjacent beds, both experiencing similar symptoms of terror and delirium. Again, she worked with her hands, channeling healing energy while maintaining the pretense of using conventional treatments. But she could feel the officials' eyes on her, studying every movement and cataloging every impossibly rapid recovery. By the time she had treated all the affected children, the assembled witnesses had seen enough to draw conclusions that would be dangerous for everyone involved. Each child had recovered completely within minutes of her touch, showing improvements that violated every principle of conventional medicine. "Miss Bennett," Marshal Dawson said formally as she emerged from the last treatment room, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about the methods you've employed here today." "The only thing that matters is that the children are well," Clara replied firmly, though she knew her defiance wouldn't protect her from whatever consequences Crawford had arranged. Crawford stepped forward with triumph evident in his expression. "Gentlemen, I think you've seen enough to draw your own conclusions about the nature of Miss Bennett's abilities. The question now is what territorial law requires be done about practitioners of supernatural healing." Administrator Phillips consulted a leather-bound document he'd been carrying. "The territorial statutes are quite clear about activities that fall outside the bounds of conventional Christian practice. When such activities are employed in medical contexts, they constitute illegal practice of medicine combined with," he paused delicately, "activities of a potentially supernatural nature, which carries what penalty?" Judge Morrison asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Imprisonment pending trial, with the possibility of more severe consequences depending on the specific charges that are filed," Administrator Phillips replied with bureaucratic precision. Clara felt the walls closing in around her with terrible familiarity. Despite her careful attempts to conceal her true nature, Crawford's trap had worked perfectly. She had been forced to reveal abilities that territorial law would classify as witchcraft, providing legal justification for whatever punishment he had planned. Tom stepped closer to her, his scarred face hard with determination. "Gentlemen, I think you're forgetting something important. These children were poisoned by someone who used their suffering to manipulate Clara into this situation. Instead of arresting the woman who saved their lives, maybe you should be investigating the man who endangered them in the first place." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Mitchell," Marshal Dawson said warningly. "Do you have evidence to support such claims?" "As a matter of fact, I do," Clara said quietly, reaching into her medical bag to withdraw several small glass vials she had collected during their investigation of Crawford's surveying activities. "These contain residues of the specific plant, toxins that were used to poison the families, toxins that were harvested from locations where Mr. Crawford's men had been conducting surveys." Crawford's face remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. "Miss Bennett, I hardly think plant samples qualify as proof of intentional poisoning. Many of the native flora here are toxic by nature." "That's true," Clara conceded, "but not in the specific combinations used here, nor prepared in ways that would enhance their toxicity while making them nearly impossible to trace. Whoever crafted these poisons had an advanced understanding of both chemistry and human biology." She produced another vial, this one containing a translucent liquid that seemed to emit a faint inner glow. "This is the antidote I developed. It works because I understood exactly which compounds were used and how they would interact within the human body." Administrator Phillips leaned in, his interest clearly piqued. "And how does a supposed mail-order bride from Pennsylvania come by such specialized expertise?" The question cut straight through Clara's carefully maintained disguise, but she didn't flinch. The same way a government administrator ends up in a secluded valley just as children fall mysteriously ill. Sometimes people aren't who they appear to be. The insinuation landed heavily, like smoke hanging in the air after a gunshot. Crawford's web of influence clearly stretched further than most had realized, possibly right into the heart of the territorial administration. "Miss Bennett," Marshal Dawson said, his voice low and sharp, "are you accusing government officials of criminal involvement?" "I'm saying that such convenient timing doesn't happen by accident," Clara replied, her tone steady. "And before you arrest anyone for unauthorized medical practice, maybe look into who had the skills, means, and motive to create the poisons in the first place." Tom had been watching in silence, but now his eyes lit with understanding. "You made one mistake, Crawford. You assumed Clara would be too afraid of her past to speak up. But you didn't count on her being more afraid of letting children suffer than of protecting herself." From the corner of the room, running bear silent until now spoke with calm authority. "In my culture, those who harm children for power lose their right to protection from law or tradition. Such men become outcasts hunted by all who honor innocence." Her words struck deeper than mere threats, and several officials shifted uneasily. Whatever political shield Crawford thought he had might not protect him from crimes against children. Dr. Hayes, who had been treating the recovered children, now stepped forward, his professional stature unmistakable. "I've practiced medicine in this region for over 2 decades. I've never witnessed recoveries like these from symptoms this severe. Call Miss Bennett's methods whatever you like, unorthodox, mystical, but they saved lives where standard medicine failed." "The issue isn't effectiveness," Phillips responded stiffly. "It's legality under territorial law." "Then perhaps," Clara said, her voice like tempered steel, "we should examine all relevant laws, including the ones about poisoning civilians and using political authority for personal agendas." For the first time, Crawford's polished exterior cracked, revealing the cold strategist beneath. "You're making serious accusations, Miss Bennett, ones you can't possibly back up against individuals far more powerful than a runaway mail order bride," but his wording gave him away. How did he know she was a fugitive unless he dug deeper into her past than he'd admitted? Tom caught it instantly. Fugitive? Interesting choice of words, Crawford. What do you know about Clara's past that the rest of us don't? I know enough, Crawford replied, regaining confidence, to be aware she fled legal trouble in Pennsylvania, charges tied to witchcraft and the deaths of several people who put their faith in her so-called healing powers. The accusation landed like a blow, dragging back the memories Clara had tried so hard to bury. Crawford had done his homework, and he'd come prepared to weaponize her past. That's not what happened, she said softly, though she could see doubt creeping into the faces of those who had supported her. Isn't it? Crawford pressed on, unrelenting. Why don't you tell him about the family who died after you? Failed to treat their consumption? Or the child left permanently harmed by one of your experiments? Or the mob that chased you from town when things went wrong? Every word was aimed at dismantling the trust she had built in Cedar Falls. The guilt of her past failures began to settle on her like a heavy cloak. But before she could speak, Tom stepped forward. Clara, I don't care what happened back in Pennsylvania. I care about what you've done here and the kind of person you've shown yourself to be. The past doesn't define us, our present. Choices do. His words gave Clara the strength to lift her head and meet Crawford's glare. You're right about Pennsylvania, she said, her voice clear. I made mistakes. People I tried to help didn't survive. And yes, I ran when those mistakes were twisted into something darker. She took a breath, but I didn't stop there. I learned, I refined my methods. I became more cautious, more aware of what I could and couldn't do. And I learned that true courage is trying to help even when you're afraid to fail. She looked around at the gathered faces, some skeptical, some supportive, all waiting for her next words. I'm what you might call a natural healer. I can direct energy through my hands, encourage the body to heal itself, and occasionally achieve what medicine alone cannot. I don't fully understand how or why I have this ability, but I know it comes from a desire to help rather than harm. The admission sent ripples of shock through the assembled group, but Clara continued before anyone could interrupt. Mr. Crawford is right about my past failures, but he's wrong about my motivations and methods. I came to Cedar Falls not to practice illegal medicine, but to find a place where I could use my abilities to help people without fear of persecution. The fact that children were being deliberately poisoned forced me to act, regardless of the consequences to myself. Marshal Dawson exchanged glances with Administrator Phillips, clearly uncertain how to proceed in a situation that had become far more complex than a simple case of illegal medical practice. It was Running Bear who broke the tense silence with words that carried the authority of generations. Those who speak against the healing of children speak against the will of the Great Spirit. Such people bring darkness to themselves and all who follow them. Crawford's face twisted with fury at the implicit spiritual condemnation. Enough of this superstitious nonsense. Marshal, you have clear evidence of illegal medical practice and admission of supernatural activities. Arrest her. But Marshal Dawson hesitated, looking around at a room full of healthy children who had been dying hours earlier, at families reunited with loved ones they had thought lost, at a community that was beginning to understand the true nature of the forces working against them. Mr. Crawford, he said slowly, I think there are some questions that need answering before anyone gets arrested. Starting with how you knew so much about Miss Bennett's background and why you happened to be so conveniently available when these children took sick. The tide was beginning to turn, Clara realized, as even territorial officials began to question the convenient coincidences that had brought them all together. But Crawford still had cards to play, and his desperation was making him increasingly dangerous. Very well, Crawford said with cold finality. If territorial law won't address this situation properly, then community justice will have to suffice. He stepped toward the door, and Clara caught a glimpse of armed men gathering. Outside, not officials or lawmen, but hired guns waiting for their employer's signal. The real battle was about to begin, and Clara realized that all her healing abilities might not be enough to protect the people who had chosen to stand with her against the forces of greed and corruption that threatened to destroy Cedar Falls. The armed men outside Dr. Hayes' medical practice represented more than just hired muscle. Clara realized as she studied their faces through the window. These were hardened professionals, men who killed for money and asked no questions about the righteousness of their cause. Crawford had come prepared for violence, confident that intimidation and force would succeed where legal manipulation had failed. "Marshal Dawson," Tom said quietly, his hand resting on his gun butt, "seems to me you've got a choice to make here. You can arrest a woman who saved children's lives, or you can deal with the man who endangered them and is now threatening this entire community." Marshal Dawson's weathered face showed the internal struggle of a man caught between conflicting loyalties. His eyes moved from Clara to Crawford to the armed men visible through the windows, calculating odds and consequences with the practiced assessment of someone who had survived in dangerous territory by making correct decisions quickly. "Mr. Crawford," he said finally, his voice carrying official authority, "I think you need to call off your men and accompany me to the territorial courthouse for questioning about these poisoning allegations." Crawford's laugh held no warmth or humor. "Marshal, I think you've forgotten who pays your salary and who has the connections to end your career with a single telegram to Denver. Miss Bennett is a fugitive wanted for illegal medical practice and possible witchcraft. Your duty is clear." "My duty," Marshal Dawson replied with steel creeping into his voice, "is to uphold territorial law, not to serve the interests of land speculators who poison children to manipulate their families." The confrontation between the two men crystallized the larger conflict that had been building throughout the valley. On one side stood those who believed in law, order, and the protection of innocent people. On the other stood those who viewed law as a tool to be manipulated for personal gain, regardless of the human cost. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with the quiet authority that came from decades of serving his community. "Gentlemen, while you debate legal technicalities, I have 7 children who are alive today because Clara Bennett risked everything to save them. In my medical opinion, anyone who opposes her healing work is opposing life itself." Administrator Phillips consulted his leather-bound documents with the mechanical precision of a bureaucrat seeking refuge in regulations. "The territorial statutes regarding supernatural practices are quite specific, Doctor. Regardless of outcomes, certain activities are prohibited by law." "And what about the territorial statutes regarding attempted murder?" Clara asked quietly, her voice cutting through the political maneuvering. "Because that's exactly what Crawford has been doing, systematically poisoning families to force them off land he wants to acquire." She reached into her medical bag and withdrew a small journal bound in leather, its pages filled with careful notes and observations. "I've documented everything: which families were targeted, what specific toxins were used, where the plants were harvested, and how the poisons were administered. This isn't speculation or accusation. This is evidence." Running Bear moved closer to Clara, her presence radiating the protective strength of someone who had decided to stand against injustice regardless of personal cost. "The spirits of this valley cry out against those who harm children for profit. Such men bring darkness that spreads like infection through the land." Crawford's facade of civilized negotiation finally collapsed entirely, revealing the brutal opportunist beneath. "Enough of this primitive superstition and legal posturing. I came here to resolve a problem, and I'm going to resolve it one way or another." He gestured toward his men outside, and Clara saw them begin moving into position around the medical practice. These weren't the confused actions of men operating on impulse. This was a coordinated assault planned by someone who had considered all the possibilities and prepared for violent resistance. Tom stepped protectively in front of Clara, his scarred face grim with understanding. Crawford, you're making a mistake that's going to cost you more than you can afford. Am I? Crawford smiled with predatory confidence. A territorial marshal, a territorial administrator, and a territorial judge all witnessed that a suspected witch resisted lawful arrest and had to be subdued by force. Tragic, but legally justified under territorial law. The trap was complete, Clara realized. Even if she survived the immediate violence, Crawford's version of events would become the official record. She would be posthumously branded a dangerous criminal, while he would be hailed as a man who had protected the community from supernatural threats. But as she looked around the room at the faces of people who had chosen to stand with her despite the danger, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since her desperate flight from Pennsylvania, the power that came from being part of a community willing to fight for what was right. "Mr. Crawford," she said with calm certainty, "I think you've made one critical error in your calculations. And what might that be? You assumed that the people of Cedar Falls would abandon me when they learned what I really am. But you've spent so much time thinking about legal technicalities and political connections that you forgot something important about frontier communities." Clara moved toward the window where Crawford's armed men were taking their positions, her voice carrying clearly to everyone in the room. "Out here, people care more about what you do than what you are. They care more about results than regulations. And they especially care about protecting their children from men who would poison them for profit." As if summoned by her words, figures began emerging from buildings throughout Cedar Falls, armed ranchers and farmers, townspeople carrying rifles and shotguns, even some of Crawford's own surveyors who had apparently decided they wanted no part in harming children. Within minutes, Crawford's hired guns found themselves outnumbered 3-1 by angry residents who had made their choice clear. Sheriff Williams appeared at the head of the growing crowd, his weathered face showing the determination of a man who had finally decided which side of the conflict represented justice. "Crawford," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone backed by his entire community, "you and your men have exactly 1 minute to mount up and ride out of Cedar Falls. After that, we start treating you as the threats to our families that you've proven yourselves to be." Administrator Phillips looked around nervously at the armed citizens surrounding the medical practice. "Sheriff Williams, you can't simply ignore territorial authority. These men have legal standing to conduct their investigation. These men," Sheriff Williams replied with contempt, "have been systematically poisoning children to manipulate their families into selling land. I don't care what kind of legal authority they claim to have. Anyone who hurts kids in my town answers to frontier justice." Marshal Dawson found himself facing a choice that would define not just his career, but his character. He could side with territorial authority and political connections, or he could stand with a community protecting itself from predators who used law as a weapon against the innocent. "Sheriff Williams is right," he said finally, his voice carrying across the tense gathering. "My investigation has revealed evidence of systematic poisoning designed to manipulate land sales. Mr. Crawford, you and your associates are under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy." Crawford's face twisted with fury as his carefully laid plans crumbled around him. "You fools have no idea what you're opposing. I represent interests far more powerful than this pathetic collection of farmers and shopkeepers. There will be consequences for this defiance." "Let them come," Tom said quietly, his hand steady on his gun. "This valley has faced worse than corrupt politicians and hired killers. We'll face whatever comes next the same way we've faced everything else, together." Dr. Hayes emerged from the back rooms where the recovered children were resting, his professional authority adding weight to the community's resistance. "Gentlemen, I've been practicing medicine on this frontier for 20 years, and I've never seen anything as evil as what Mr. Crawford has done to these families. Whatever legal authority he claims, it doesn't extend to harming innocent children." The confrontation had reached its crucial moment, Clara realized. Crawford could still choose to retreat and fight another day, or he could escalate to violence and face the consequences of a community united in defense of their own. Crawford made his choice with characteristic ruthlessness. His hand moved toward the gun he wore beneath his expensive coat, and his hired men began raising their weapons in response to his signal. But before the first shot could be fired, Clara stepped forward with her hands raised peacefully. "Stop," she said, her voice carrying across the tense gathering with supernatural clarity. "Enough blood has been spilled because of me. Let's end this without more violence." "Clara, no," Tom said urgently, but she was already walking toward Crawford with steady determination. "Mr. Crawford," she said, stopping just beyond arm's reach, "you want me to face justice for my abilities and past failures. Very well. But let's settle this honestly, without involving innocent people who've done nothing but show kindness to a stranger." Crawford's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but his hand remained near his weapon. "What are you proposing?" Test," Clara replied simply. "You claim my healing abilities are dangerous and illegal. I claim you've been poisoning families to steal their land. Let's see which of us the community believes when all the evidence is presented openly." She gestured toward the assembled crowd of townspeople, farmers, and ranchers who had come to witness the confrontation. "These people have lived with the consequences of both our actions. Let them judge which of us deserves their trust." It was a dangerous gamble, Clara knew. Public opinion could be fickle, and Crawford had resources she could never match. But she also understood that frontier communities valued honesty and courage above political connections and legal technicalities. Running Bear stepped forward to stand beside Clara, her weathered face showing approval. "The woman speaks wisdom. Let the community see the truth of both paths and choose which they will follow." Dr. Hayes joined them, his medical bag in hand. "I'm willing to testify about everything I've witnessed, both the children's mysterious illnesses and their miraculous recoveries. The evidence speaks for itself." One by one, other members of the community stepped forward to add their voices to Clara's defense. Parents whose children had been saved, neighbors who had benefited from her quiet assistance, even some of Crawford's own workers who had grown disgusted with their employers' methods. Crawford found himself isolated in the center of a hostile crowd, his hired guns outnumbered and his political allies uncertain. The tide of public opinion was turning against him with devastating force. "This is ridiculous," he snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I won't be judged by a mob of ignorant frontier settlers." "Then you'll be judged by territorial law," Marshal Dawson said firmly, stepping forward with handcuffs ready. "Mr. Crawford, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and corruption of official proceedings." The moment stretched, taut as Crawford weighed his options. He could surrender and face trial, knowing his political connections might still protect him. He could resist arrest and face immediate violence from an angry community. Or he could attempt to flee in hope, to fight another day from a position of greater strength. He chose flight, spinning toward his horse while drawing his gun in a desperate attempt to shoot his way clear. But Tom was faster, his own weapon appearing with the fluid speed of someone who had survived frontier violence through superior reflexes. Crawford's shot went wide, splintering wood from the medical practice's front door. Tom's bullet took the land speculator in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping his gun from nerveless fingers. "It's over, Crawford," Sheriff Williams said as he and Marshal Dawson moved to secure the wounded man. "Your hired guns are surrounded, your political protection has evaporated, and this community has made its choice about who they trust." As Crawford's men threw down their weapons in surrender, Clara felt a weight she had carried for years finally lifting from her shoulders. The confrontation she had dreaded since fleeing Pennsylvania was finished, and she had survived not by hiding or running, but by standing firm with people who valued truth over convenience. Tom moved to her side, his smoking gun already holstered. "Are you all right?" "Better than all right," she replied, looking around at the faces of neighbors who had risked everything to defend her. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong." Dr. Hayes approached with his medical bag, ready to tend Crawford's wound, despite everything the man had done. "Even our enemies deserve medical care," he said simply, embodying the healing principles that Clara had tried to follow throughout her ordeal. As the immediate crisis passed, Clara found herself surrounded by families whose children she had saved, neighbors who had offered support, and community leaders who had chosen justice over political expedience. The future was still uncertain, but it would be faced by people united in common cause rather than divided by fear and suspicion. Running Bear placed a weathered hand on Clara's shoulder. "The spirits of the valley are at peace now," she said quietly. "The darkness has been driven away, and the healing can truly begin." Marshal Dawson finished securing Crawford and his remaining men before approaching Clara with official formality. "Miss Bennett, there will still need to be a formal investigation into these events, but I want you to know that you'll have the full protection of territorial law while that process unfolds." "Thank you, Marshal," Clara replied. "I'm ready to answer any questions and face whatever consequences come from my choices." "The only consequence," Tom said firmly, taking her hand in his, "is that you're going to spend the rest of your life helping this community heal and grow, starting with marrying me and making this house a home again." Clara looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw not just love, but acceptance of everything she was: healer and fugitive, saint and sinner, woman of extraordinary gifts and ordinary human fears. "Thomas Mitchell, are you sure you want to marry someone whose life tends to be complicated?" "Clara Bennett," he replied with a smile that transformed his scarred features. "I've learned that the best things in life are worth a little complication." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the valley in shades of gold and promise, Clara finally understood what Running Bear had meant about the spirits being at peace. The community had faced its greatest test and emerged stronger, bound together by shared sacrifice and common purpose. The healing touch she had always carried would continue to serve these people, but now it was supported by something even more powerful: the knowledge that she was no longer alone in the world, that she had found a place where her gifts were valued rather than feared. Crawford would face justice for his crimes, his hired guns would scatter to find new employers, and the families of Cedar Falls would rebuild their lives with the security of knowing they were protected by neighbors willing to fight for what was right. The mail-order bride, who had arrived carrying secrets and fear, had become something more: a cornerstone of a community that had chosen love over fear, healing over harm, and truth over convenient lies. The future stretched before them all, bright with possibility and strengthened by the bonds forged in their darkest hour. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.